About 7 years ago, Sherry and I flew out to California to visit my parents. When we sat down for dinner, the first night we were there, before we began, my mother looked at me and said, "Terry, did you wash your hands?" Now, I was 51 years old, and my mother is still asking me if I washed my hands before dinner. You see, that was an important ritual in our home, washing your hands before you ate. Well, the whole time I was growing up, and apparently it was still an important ritual to my mother. And it's probably a good ritual. Washing your hands before eating is just good hygiene. It eliminates the germs, right? But the reason why the Pharisees got so upset that Jesus' disciples were not washing their hands before eating was more than a matter of good hygiene. It was about keeping the law. God had given them the law after they had escaped from their bondage in Egypt while they were wandering out in the wilderness. Those laws kept them united. And those laws created their identity as the chosen people of God. So the law was very important to them. But obeying the laws was complicated. In some cases, the laws gave very clear instructions about what to do or what not to do. But other times, the law simply provided some moral principle that was open to interpretation. So eventually, a group of scholars, usually called the scribes, developed thousands of extra little rules as a kind of fence around the original law in order to keep them from being broken. These rules are the tradition of the elders that we hear mentioned in this morning's gospel. One of these rules had to do with washing your hands. Now, it wasn't a bad rule. It was good hygiene, of course. But beyond that, one of the gifts that the Jewish tradition has given us all, especially the Pharisaic tradition, is the idea of the sanctification of time. How to make daily routines, like eating a meal, become a sacred act. So rituals like washing your hands and saying a prayer before eating transform the meal into a holy moment in time. But there were some problems with all these rules. All these little fences built up around the law. First, there were just too many rules. To follow them all literally meant that that was all that you could focus on. You could easily forget the reason that you're even following all those rules. If the rules became the primary concern, then unity with God and unity with one another could easily get lost. And over time, another problem came up. If you broke any of these rules, some people will consider you no longer a member of that community. If someone ate unclean food, or made the food unclean by touching it with unclean hands, then that person themselves would become unclean. They would become an untouchable, you might say, an outcast, one to be shunned. This is the idea that Jesus spoke out against over and over again, as he did in this morning's gospel. You are not made unclean by breaking one of these rules. You are not made unclean by touching a sick person to heal them. You are not made unclean by who your parents happen to be. And you're not made unclean by eating the wrong food or not washing your hands. As Jesus put it, nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. And this is good news. The good news is that the kingdom that Jesus proclaims, in that kingdom, no one is considered beyond redemption. We do not reject anyone because they have not followed the rules, or because some people in the community identify someone as being unclean. No one gets written off in God's kingdom. No one gets left behind. You see, we have to be careful about this rule thing. Sometimes our rules are not necessarily God's rules, even if we imagine they are. You might recall the story of the fiddler on the roof. The father is so adamant about the importance of tradition that he turns his back on the love of his daughter, who's married a Gentile. What a sad ending. Now, as a good Anglican, I'm all for good ritual. And I strive to follow the rubrics, the rules found in our Book of Common Prayer. But our ritual and our rules are intended to draw us closer to God. Because without God, they're empty gestures. They're worthless words. We have to be careful about rules. There's a true story that I was once told about an interim priest who went to a new parish after the rector, their beloved rector of 30 years, had retired. And so after the first Sunday, he met with the wardens and asked them, well, how did it go? And the warden said, well, it was okay. Interim knew there was something wrong. He said, all right, come on, out with it. What's wrong? What went wrong? So finally, one of the wardens said, well, when you were serving communion, you didn't touch the south wall. That needed some explanation. It seems that their beloved rector of 30 years had had one bad leg. And so when he got to the end of the communion line, he would rest his hand on the south wall as he turned so he didn't lose his balance. After 30 years, that became part of the ritual. The priest had to touch the south wall. And this priest had not touched the south wall, so everyone was not sure if that was a valid communion service. We have to be careful about our rules. Because in the end, it's not about rules. As St. Augustine put it, love God and then do as you will. If our heart is in the right place, we are set free to do as we will. If we have given our hearts to God, we won't break any of the rules that really matter to God. If our relationship with God is healthy, everything we do and everything we say, everything that comes from us will be a living witness of the way God has transformed our lives. May we remember that in God's eyes, no one is beyond redemption. And may our every word and our every deed proclaim that we are disciples of Jesus Christ. And in case any of you are curious, yes, I did wash my hands in the sacristy before vesting this morning. I'm sure you all approve of that ritual. I know my mother would.